One morning, as Gregor Samsa was awakening from unsettled dreams, he discovered that in his bed he had been transformed into a monstrous, verminous insect. He lay upon his armor-hard back and perceived, as he lifted his head slightly, his brown, arched abdomen divided into rigid, bow-like segments. From this vantage point, the blanket, on the verge of sliding off completely, could barely maintain its position. His numerous legs, pitiably thin in contrast to the remainder of his girth, flickered helplessly before his eyes. "What has befallen me?" he mused. It was no mere dream. His room, a proper chamber for a human, albeit somewhat too small, rested silently between the four familiar walls. Above the table, upon which an unpacked assortment of cloth samples was displayed — Samsa was a traveling salesman — hung the picture he had recently excised from an illustrated magazine and placed in a comely gilt frame. It depicted a woman adorned with a fur hat and a fur boa. She sat erect, presenting towards the viewer a substantial fur muff into which her entire forearm vanished. Gregor's gaze then shifted to the window. The dismal weather — raindrops were audibly descending upon the metal window ledge — imbued him with a profound melancholy. Why not continue sleeping a while longer and dismiss all this folly? He pondered. But this was wholly impractical, for he was accustomed to sleeping on his right side, and in his current condition, he could not maneuver himself into that posture. Regardless of how forcefully he flung himself onto his right side, he invariably rolled back onto his spine. He must have attempted it 100 times, shutting his eyes to avoid the sight of the squirming legs, and desisted only when he began to experience a faint, dull ache in his side, a sensation previously unknown to him. "Oh heavens," he thought, "what an arduous profession I've selected. Day in, day out on the road. The pressures of commerce are far greater than the work at the main office, and beyond that, I must contend with the trials of travel, anxieties about train connections, erratic poor meals, and ephemeral, ever-shifting human liaisons naushniki, which never emanate from the heart, to perdition with it all." He perceived a slight itch atop his abdomen. He slowly propelled himself on his back nearer to the bedpost to lift his head more readily, located the itchy spot, entirely covered with small white flecks. He knew not what to make of them, and desired to explore the area with a leg, but he withdrew it instantly, for the contact felt like a chilling douse over his entire being. He slid back once more to his prior position. This early rising, he reflected, renders a man quite foolish. A man requires his sleep. Other traveling salesmen live like odalisks in a seraglio. For instance, when I return to the inn during the morning to transcribe the requisite orders, these gentlemen are only then seating themselves for breakfast. Were I to attempt such a thing with my superior, I'd be summarily dismissed. Still, who can say whether that mightn't actually be beneficial for me? If I hadn't restrained myself for my parents' sake, I would have resigned ages ago. I would have approached the boss and conveyed to him precisely my innermost thoughts. He would have toppled Pram from his desk. How peculiar it is to be seated at the desk and address an employee from such a height. The boss has hearing difficulties, so the employee must step quite close to him. In any event, I haven't entirely relinquished that hope yet. Once I have amassed the funds to settle my parents' debt to him, that should require another 5 or 6 years, I shall certainly do it. Then I'll make the grand departure. In any case, right now I must arise. My train departs at 5 o'clock. and he glanced towards the alarm clock ticking away beside the chest of drawers. Good Lord, he thought. It was 6:30, and the hands were advancing silently. It was beyond the half hour, already approaching 1:45. Could the alarm have neglected to sound? One could discern from the bed that it was correctly set for 4 o'clock. Assuredly it had rung. Yes, but was it feasible to slumber through this cacophony that made the furniture vibrate? Now, it is true he had not slept peacefully, but evidently he had slept all the more profoundly. Nevertheless, what was he to do now? The subsequent train departed at 7 o'clock. To catch that one, he would have to proceed in a frantic rush. The sample collection was not yet packed, and he genuinely did not feel particularly refreshed or energetic. And even if he caught the train, there was no averting a confrontation with the boss, because the firm's errand boy would have awaited the 5 o'clock train and reported the news of his absence long since. He was the boss's lackey, devoid of spine or intellect. Well then, what if he reported in ill? But that would be exceedingly awkward and suspicious, because during his 5 years of service, Gregor hadn't been indisposed even once. The boss would undoubtedly arrive with a doctor from the health insurance company and would censure his parents for their indolent son and curtail all objections with the insurance doctor's pronouncements. For him, everyone was perfectly healthy, but truly lethargic about work. And besides, would the doctor in this instance be entirely mistaken? Apart from a truly excessive drowsiness after the long slumber, Gregor in fact felt quite well and even possessed a genuinely strong appetite. As he was mulling all this over in the utmost haste, without being able to reach the decision to get out of bed, the alarm clock was indicating precisely 7:15, there was a gentle rap on the door by the head of the bed. "Gregor?" a voice inquired. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Don't you intend to be on your way?" The soft voice. Gregor was startled when he heard his own voice respond. It was clearly and unmistakably his former voice, but intermingled within it, as if from below, was an irrepressibly painful squeak, which rendered the words positively distinct only in the initial moment and distorted them in the reverberation, so that one was unsure if one had heard correctly. Gregor wished to reply in detail and elucidate everything, but in these circumstances he restricted himself to saying, Yes, thank you, Mother. I'm getting up straight away." Owing to the wooden door, the alteration in Gregor's voice was not genuinely perceptible outside, so his mother, appeased by this explanation, shuffled away. However, as a consequence of the brief conversation, the other family members became cognizant of the fact that Gregor was unexpectedly still at home, and already his father was knocking on one side door, feebly, but with his fist. "Gregor," he called out. "What is amiss?" And after a short interval, he urged him on again in a deeper voice. "Gregor! At the other side door, however, his sister knocked lightly. "Gregor, are you all right? Do you require anything?" Gregor directed replies in both directions. "I shall be ready forthwith." He made an effort with the most meticulous articulation, and by interjecting long pauses between the individual words to divest his voice of anything remarkable. His father returned to his breakfast. However, the sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I implore you." Gregor had no intention of opening the door, but congratulated himself on his precaution, acquired from traveling, of securing all doors during the night, even at home. Primarily, he wished to stand up quietly and without disturbance, dress himself, above all have breakfast, and only then contemplate further action, for, he noted this distinctly, by pondering matters in bed he would not arrive at a sensible conclusion. He recalled having often felt a slight pain or other discomfort in bed, perhaps stemming from an awkward sleeping posture, which later proved to be purely imaginary upon standing, and he was eager to observe how his present fancies would gradually dissolve. That the change in his voice was nothing more than the onset of a genuine chill, an occupational malady of commercial travelers, of that he entertained not the slightest doubt. It was exceedingly simple to cast aside the blanket. He merely needed to push himself up a little, and it fell of its own accord. But to proceed further was arduous, particularly because he was so unusually broad. He required arms and hands to propel himself upright. Instead of these, however, he possessed only numerous small limbs which were ceaselessly moving with highly diverse motions, and which, furthermore, he was unable to govern. If he wished to flex one of them, then it was the first to extend itself, and if he finally succeeded in doing with this limb what he intended, in the meantime all the others, as if unfettered, moved about in an excessively painful agitation. "But I must not remain in bed ineffectually," said Gregor to himself. Initially he desired to get off the bed with the lower part of his body, but this lower part, which incidentally he had not yet inspected, and which he also couldn't clearly envision, proved itself too challenging to move. The attempt progressed so slowly. When, having become almost frantic, he finally launched himself forward with all his might and without deliberation, he misjudged his direction, and he struck the lower bedpost hard. The violent pain he felt revealed to him that the lower part of his body was at that moment likely the most sensitive. Thus, he endeavored to extricate his upper body from the bed first, and cautiously turned his head toward the edge of the bed. He managed this with ease, and despite its breadth and weight, his body mass at last slowly followed the rotation of his head. But as he finally raised his head outside the bed into the open air, he grew anxious about advancing any further in this manner, for if he allowed himself eventually to fall by this process, it would require a miracle to prevent his head from sustaining injury, and at all costs he must not lose consciousness right now. He preferred to remain in bed. However, after a similar exertion, while he lay there again sighing as before, and once more observed his small limbs struggling against one another, if anything more fiercely than before, and perceived no chance of imposing calm and order upon this arbitrary movement, he reiterated to himself that he couldn't possibly stay in bed, and that it might be the most reasonable course to sacrifice everything if there existed even the slightest hope of extricating himself from bed in the process. At the same moment, however, he did not neglect to remind himself periodically of the fact that tranquility, indeed the calmest reflection, might be superior to the most muddled decisions. At such junctures, he directed his gaze as precisely as he could toward the window, but regrettably there was little confident cheer to be derived from a glance at the morning mist, which obscured even the opposite side of the narrow street. "It is already 7 o'clock, he told himself at the latest striking of the alarm clock. Already 7 o'clock and still such a fog. And for a brief while longer he lay quietly with shallow breathing, as if perhaps awaiting the re-emergence of normal and natural conditions out of the complete stillness. But then he said to himself, "Before it strikes 7:15, whatever transpires, I must be completely out of bed. Besides, by then someone from the office will arrive to inquire about me, because the office will open before 7 o'clock. And he then made an effort to rock his entire body length out of the bed with a uniform motion. If he let himself fall out of the bed in this way, his head, which in the course of the fall he intended to lift sharply, would probably remain uninjured. His back seemed to be hard. Nothing would really happen to that as a result of the fall. His greatest apprehension was a worry about the loud noise which the fall must generate, and which presumably would arouse, if not fright, then at least concern on the other side of all the doors. However, it had to be attempted. As Gregor was in the process of levering himself half out of bed, the new method was more akin to a game than an exertion. He needed only to rock with a consistent rhythm. It occurred to him how facile all this would be if someone were to come to his assistance. Two strong individuals, he thought of his father and the servant girl, would have been entirely sufficient. They would have only had to thrust their arms beneath his arched back to remove him from the bed, to bend down with their burden, and then merely to exercise patience and care that he completed the flip onto the floor, where his diminutive legs would then, he hoped, acquire a purpose. Now, quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked, should he truly cry out for aid? Despite all his distress, he was unable to suppress a smile at this notion. He had already reached the point where, with a more vigorous rocking, he maintained his equilibrium with difficulty, and very soon he would finally have to decide, for in 5 minutes it would be 7:15. Then the bell at the apartment door rang. "That's someone from the office," he told himself, and he almost stiffened while his small limbs only danced about all the faster. For a moment, everything remained still. "They aren't opening," Gregor said to himself, ensnared in some absurd hope. But of course then, as customary, the servant girl with her firm tread went to the door and opened it. Gregor needed to hear only the visitor's initial word of greeting to recognize immediately who it was, the manager himself. Why was Gregor the sole individual condemned to work in a firm where, at the slightest misstep, someone immediately attracted the gravest suspicion? Were all the employees then collectively, every single one, scoundrels? Was there then among them no truly devoted person who, if he neglected to use just a couple of hours in the morning for office duties, would become unhinged from pangs of conscience and genuinely be in no fit state to leave his bed? Was it truly insufficient to dispatch an apprentice to make inquiries, if such questioning was even warranted? Must the manager himself appear, and in the process, must it be demonstrated to the entire blameless family that the investigation of this suspicious circumstance could only be entrusted to the manager's intelligence? And more as a consequence of the agitated state into which this idea plunged Gregor than as a result of a deliberate decision, he swung himself with all his might out of the bed. There was a loud thud, but not a genuine crash. The fall was somewhat cushioned by the carpet, and furthermore, his back was more elastic than Gregor had supposed. For that reason, the dull noise was not quite so conspicuous. But he had not held his head up with adequate care, and had struck it. He turned his head, irritated and in pain, and rubbed it on the carpet. "Something has fallen in there," said the manager in the adjacent room on the left. Gregor attempted to imagine whether anything similar to what was transpiring with him today could also have occurred at some point to the manager. At least one had to concede the possibility of such a thing. However, as if to provide a rough answer to this query, the manager now took a few resolute steps in the next room with a squeak from his polished boots. From the neighboring room on the right, the sister was whispering to inform Gregor, "Gregor, the manager is here." "I know," said Gregor to himself, but he did not venture to make his voice loud enough for his sister to hear. "Gregor," his father now said from the adjoining room on the left, "Mr. Manager has arrived and is asking why you have not departed on the early train. We don't know what we should tell him. Besides, he also wishes to speak to you personally. So please open the door. He will be good enough to overlook the untidiness in your room." In the midst of all this, the manager called out in a friendly tone, "Good morning, Mr. Samsa." "He is not well," said his mother to the manager, while his father was still speaking at the door. He is not well, believe me, Mr. Manager. Otherwise, how would Gregor miss a train? The young man has nothing in his head except business. I'm almost cross that he never goes out at night. Right now he's been in the city 8 days, but he's been at home every evening. He sits there with us at the table and reads the newspaper quietly or studies his travel itineraries. It's quite a diversion for him if he occupies himself with fretwork. For instance, he fashioned a small frame over the course of 2 or 3 evenings. You'd be amazed how pretty it is. It's hanging right inside the room. You'll see it immediately as soon as Gregor opens the door. Anyway, I'm glad that you're here, Mr. Manager. By ourselves, we would never have induced Gregor to open the door. He's so stubborn, and he's certainly not well, although he denied that this morning. I'm coming straight away, said Gregor slowly and deliberately, and didn't move, so as not to miss a single word of the conversation. My dear lady, I cannot explain it to myself in any other fashion, said the manager. I hope it is nothing serious. On the other hand, I must also state that we business people, fortunately or unfortunately, however one views it, very often simply have to overcome a slight indisposition for business imperatives. So can Mr. Manager come in to see you now? Asked his father impatiently and knocked once more on the door. No, said Gregor. In the neighboring room on the left, a painful stillness descended. In the neighboring room on the right, the sister began to sob. Why didn't his sister go to the others? She'd probably just arisen from bed now and hadn't even commenced dressing yet. Then why was she weeping? Because he wasn't getting up and wasn't admitting the manager, because he was in peril of losing his position, and because then his boss would badger his parents once again with the old demands. Those were likely unnecessary worries at present. Gregor was still here and wasn't contemplating at all abandoning his family. At the moment, he was lying right there on the carpet, and no one who knew of his condition would have seriously insisted that he let the manager in. But Gregor wouldn't be casually dismissed immediately because of this minor discourtesy, for which he would find an easy and suitable excuse later on. It seemed to Gregor that it might be far more reasonable to leave him in peace for the moment, instead of troubling him with crying and conversation. But it was the very uncertainty which distressed the others and excused their behavior. Mr. Samsa, the manager was now shouting, his voice elevated. What is the matter? You are barricading yourself in your room, responding with only a yes and a no, causing serious and needless trouble for your parents, and neglecting, I mention this merely incidentally, your commercial duties in a truly unheard of manner. I am speaking here in the name of your parents and your employer, and I am requesting you in all seriousness for an immediate and clear explanation. I am astounded. I believed I knew you as a calm, sensible person, and now you appear suddenly to wish to start parading around in peculiar moods. The chief indicated to me earlier this very day a possible explanation for your neglect. It pertained to the collection of cash entrusted to you a short while ago. But in truth, I almost gave him my word of honor that this explanation could not be correct. However, now I observe here your unimaginable obstinacy, and I am entirely losing any inclination to speak up for you in the slightest, and your position is not at all the most secure. Originally, I intended to mention all this to you privately, but since you are letting me squander my time here uselessly, I don't know why the matter shouldn't come to the attention of your parents. Your productivity has also been very unsatisfactory of late. Of course, it's not the season for conducting exceptional business, we acknowledge that, but a season for conducting no business. There is no such thing at all, Mr. Samsa, and such a thing must never be. But Mr. Manager, called Gregor, beside himself and in his agitation forgetting all else. I'm opening the door immediately, this very instant. A slight indisposition, a dizzy spell has prevented me from getting up. I'm still lying in bed right now, but now I'm quite refreshed once again. I'm in the process of getting out of bed. Just have patience for a brief moment. Things are not proceeding as well as I thought, but things are all right. How suddenly this can overwhelm someone. Just yesterday evening everything was fine with me. My parents certainly know that. Actually, just yesterday evening I had a minor premonition. People must have perceived that in me. Why have I not reported that to the office? But people always think that they'll recover from illness without having to stay at home. Mr. Manager, be lenient with my parents. There is truly no basis for the criticisms which you are now levying against me. And really, nobody has said a word to me about that. Perhaps you have not read the latest orders which I dispatched. Besides, now I'm setting out on my journey on the 8 o'clock train. The few hours' rest have made me stronger. Mr. Manager, do not remain. I will be at the office in person straight away. Please have the kindness to say that and to convey my respects to the chief. While Gregor was rapidly blurting all this out, scarcely conscious of what he was articulating, he had moved close to the chest of drawers without effort, likely as a result of the practice he had already acquired in bed, and now he was attempting to raise himself up on it. In truth, he wanted to open the door. He genuinely wished to allow himself to be seen by and to converse with the manager. He was keen to witness what the others now inquiring after him would say at the sight of him. If they were startled, then Gregor had no further responsibility and could be calm. But if they accepted everything quietly, then he would have no cause to become agitated, and if he got a move on, could genuinely be at the station around 8 o'clock. At first, he slid down several times from the smooth chest of drawers, but at last he gave himself a final swing and stood upright there. He was no longer at all aware of the pains in his lower body, however much they might still sting. Now he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair, on the edge of which he braced himself with his slender limbs. By doing this, he gained command over himself and kept silent, for he could now hear the manager. "Did you comprehend a single word?" the manager asked the parents. "Is he making a fool of us?" "For God's sake!" cried the mother, already in tears. "Perhaps he's very ill, and we're distressing him." "Grete! Grete!" she yelled at that point. "Mother!" called the sister from the other side. They were communicating through Gregor's room. "You must go to the doctor right away. Gregor is sick. Hurry to the doctor. Have you heard Gregor speak yet?" "That was an animal's voice," said the manager, remarkably quietly in comparison to the mother's cries. "Anna! Anna!" yelled the father through the hall into the kitchen, clapping his hands. "Fetch a locksmith immediately." And the two young women were already running through the hall with swishing skirts. How had his sister dressed herself so swiftly? And yanked open the doors of the apartment. One couldn't hear the doors closing at all. They probably had left them open, as is customary in an apartment where a tremendous misfortune has occurred. However, Gregor had become much calmer. All right, people did not comprehend his words anymore, although they seemed clear enough to him, clearer than previously, perhaps because his ears had become accustomed to them. But at least people now believed that things were not right with him, and were prepared to assist him. The confidence and assurance with which the initial arrangements had been executed made him feel good. He felt himself included once again in the circle of humanity, and was anticipating from both the doctor and the locksmith, without differentiating between them with any true precision, splendid and surprising outcomes, in order to obtain as clear a voice as possible for the critical conversation that was imminent. He coughed a little, and certainly took the trouble to do this in a truly subdued manner, since it was possible that even this sound resembled something different from a human cough. He no longer trusted himself to decide anymore. Meanwhile, in the adjacent room, it had become genuinely quiet. Perhaps his parents were sitting with the manager at the table and were whispering. Perhaps they were all leaning against the door and listening. Gregor pushed himself slowly towards the door with the aid of the easy chair, let go of it there, flung himself against the door, held himself upright against it. The pads of his tiny limbs had a little sticky substance on them, and rested there momentarily from his exertion. Then he made an effort to turn the key in the lock with his mouth. Regrettably, it appeared that he possessed no actual teeth. How then was he to grasp the key? But to compensate for that, his jaws were naturally very strong. With their help, he managed to get the key genuinely moving, and he did not notice that he was evidently inflicting some harm upon himself, for a brown fluid issued from his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped onto the floor. "Just listen for a moment," said the manager in the next room. "He's turning the key." For Gregor, that was a great encouragement, but they all should have called out to him, including his father and mother. "Come on, Gregor," they should have shouted. "Keep at it. Keep working on the lock." Imagining that all his efforts were being followed with suspense, he bit down frantically on the key with all the force he could summon. As the key turned further, he danced around the lock. Now he was holding himself upright solely with his mouth, and he had to hang on to the key or then press it down again with the entire weight of his body as necessary. The quite distinct click of the lock as it finally snapped truly awakened Gregor. Breathing heavily, he said to himself, "So I didn't require the locksmith." And he set his head against the door handle to open the door completely. Because he had to open the door in this fashion, it was already open very wide without him yet being truly visible. He first had to turn himself slowly around the edge of the door, very carefully, of course, if he did not wish to fall awkwardly on his back right at the entrance into the room. He was still preoccupied with this difficult movement and had no time to pay attention to anything else, when he heard the manager exclaim aloud, "Oh!" It sounded like the wind whistling. And now he saw him, nearest to the door, pressing his hand against his open mouth and moving slowly back, as if an invisible, constant force was impelling him away. His mother, despite the presence of the manager, she was standing here with her hair disheveled, still a mess from the night, with her hands clasped, was looking at his father. She then took 2 steps towards Gregor and collapsed right in the middle of her skirts, spreading out all around her, her face sunk on her breast, completely hidden. His father clenched his fist with a hostile expression, as if he wished to thrust Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept so that his mighty chest shook. At this point, Gregor did not take a single step into the room, but leaned his body from the inside against the firmly secured wing of the door, so that only half his body was visible, as well as his head, tilted sideways, with which he peered over at the others. Meanwhile, it had become much brighter. Standing out clearly from the other side of the street was a part of the endless gray-black house situated opposite. It was a hospital, with its severe, regular windows punctuating the facade. The rain was still falling, but only in large individual drops, visibly and firmly cast down, one by one, onto the ground. The breakfast dishes were standing piled around on the table, because for his father, breakfast was the most important mealtime of the day, which he prolonged for hours by perusing various newspapers. Directly across on the opposite wall hung a photograph of Gregor from his time in military service. It was a picture of him as a lieutenant, as he, smiling and carefree, with his hand on his sword, demanded respect for his bearing and uniform. The door to the hall was ajar, and since the door to the apartment was also open, one could see out onto the landing of the apartment and the beginning of the staircase, descending. "Now," said Gregor, fully aware that he was the only one who had maintained his composure, "I'll get dressed straight away, pack up the collection of samples, and set off. You'll permit me to embark on my way, will you not? You see, Mr. Manager, I am not obstinate, and I am happy to work. Traveling is taxing, but I couldn't exist without it. Where are you going, Mr. Manager?" "To the office." "Really? Will you report everything truthfully? A person can be momentarily incapable of work, but that is precisely the optimal time to recall earlier achievements and to consider that later, after the obstacles have been set aside, the person will work all the more keenly and intensely. I am truly so indebted to Mr. Chief. You know that perfectly well. On the other hand, I am concerned about my parents and my sister. I'm in a predicament, but I'll extricate myself from it again. Don't make things more difficult for me than they already are. Speak up on my behalf in the office. People don't like traveling salesmen, I know that. People think they earn vast sums of money and thus lead a fine life. People don't even have any particular reason to reflect on this judgment more clearly. But you, Mr. Manager, you have a better perspective on the interconnections than other people. Even, I tell you in total confidence, a better perspective than Mr. Chairman himself, who in his capacity as the employer may let his judgment make casual errors at an employee's expense. You also know well enough that the traveling salesman who is outside the office almost the entire year can so easily become a victim of gossip, coincidences, and groundless complaints, against which it's impossible for him to defend himself, since, for the most part, he doesn't hear about them at all, and only then when he's exhausted after finishing a trip, and gets to feel in his own body at home the unpleasant consequences which can't be thoroughly traced back to their origins. Mr. Manager, don't depart without uttering a word telling me that you'll at least concede that I'm somewhat in the right. But at Gregor's initial words, the manager had already turned away, and now he looked back at Gregor over his twitching shoulders with pursed lips. During Gregor's speech, he was not still for an instant, but was moving away towards the door, without taking his eyes off Gregor, yet truly gradually, as if there was a secret prohibition against leaving the room. He was already in the hall, and after the sudden movement with which he finally extricated his foot from the living room, one could have believed that he had just seared the sole of his foot. In the hall, however, he stretched out his right hand away from his body towards the staircase, as if some genuinely supernatural relief awaited him there. Gregor realized that he must not under any circumstances permit the manager to depart in this frame of mind, especially if his position in the firm was not to be placed in the direst jeopardy. His parents did not comprehend all this very well. Over the long years, they had cultivated the conviction that Gregor was set for life in his firm, and moreover, they had so much to contend with nowadays with their current troubles that all foresight was foreign to them. But Gregor possessed this foresight. The manager must be detained, calmed down, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family genuinely depended on it. If only the sister had been present. She was clever. She had already wept while Gregor was still lying quietly on his back, and the manager, this admirer of ladies, would certainly allow himself to be guided by her. She would have closed the door to the apartment and talked him out of his fright in the hall. But the sister was not even there. Gregor must address it himself. And without considering that, as yet, he knew nothing of his current ability to move, and without considering that his speech possibly, indeed, probably, had once again not been understood, He left the wing of the door, pushed himself through the opening, and intended to go over to the manager, who was already holding tight onto the handrail with both hands on the landing in a ridiculous fashion. But as he sought something to hold on to, with a small cry, Gregor immediately collapsed onto his numerous little legs. Scarcely had this occurred when he felt for the first time that morning a general physical well-being. The small limbs had firm flooring beneath them. They obeyed perfectly, as he noted with joy, and strove to carry him forward in the direction he desired. Straightway, he believed that the final amelioration of all his suffering was immediately at hand. But at the very moment when he lay on the floor, rocking in a restrained manner quite close to and directly across from his mother, apparently completely absorbed in herself, she suddenly sprang upright, with her arms spread far apart, and her fingers extended, and cried out, "Help! For God's sake, help!" She held her head bowed down, as if she wished to view Gregor better, but ran senselessly back, contradicting that gesture, forgetting that behind her stood the table with all the dishes on it. When she reached the table, she sat down heavily upon it, as if absent-mindedly, and did not appear to notice at all that next to her coffee was pouring out onto the carpet in a full stream from the large overturned container. "Mother, mother," said Gregor quietly, and looked over towards her. The manager had momentarily vanished completely from his mind. By contrast, at the sight of the flowing coffee, he couldn't prevent himself from snapping his jaws in the air a few times. At that, his mother screamed all over again, hurried from the table, and collapsed into the arms of his father, who was rushing towards her. But Gregor had no time right now for his parents. The manager was already on the staircase. His chin level with the banister, the manager looked back for the final time. Gregor made an initial movement to catch up to him if possible, but the manager must have suspected something, because he made a leap down over a few stairs and disappeared, still shouting, "Huh!" The sound echoed throughout the entire stairwell. Now, unfortunately, this flight of the manager also seemed to completely bewilder his father, who earlier had been relatively composed. For instead of running after the manager himself, or at least not hindering Gregor from his pursuit, with his right hand he seized the manager's cane, which he had left behind with his hat and overcoat on a chair. With his left hand, his father picked up a large newspaper from the table, and stamping his feet on the floor, he set out to drive Gregor back into his room by brandishing the cane and the newspaper. No plea of Gregor's was of any avail. No plea would even be understood. No matter how willingly he was to turn his head respectfully, his father just stomped all the harder with his feet. Across the room from him, his mother had pulled open a window in spite of the chilly weather, and leaning out with her hands on her cheeks, she pushed her face far outside the window. Between the alley and the stairwell, a strong draft arose. The curtains on the window billowed, the newspapers on the table swished, and individual sheets fluttered down over the floor. The father relentlessly pressed forward, emitting sibilance like a savage. Now Gregor had no practice at all in moving backwards. It was proceeding very slowly indeed. If Gregor had only been permitted to turn himself around, he would have been in his room immediately. But he was afraid to make his father impatient by the time-consuming process of turning, and each moment he faced the threat of a fatal blow on his back or his head from the cane in his father's hand. Finally, Gregor had no other recourse, for he noticed with horror that he did not yet understand how to maintain his direction while moving backwards. And so he began, amid constantly anxious sideways glances in his father's direction, to turn himself around as quickly as possible, although in truth this was only very slowly. Perhaps his father perceived his good intentions, for he did not disrupt Gregor in this motion, but with the tip of the cane from a distance, he even guided here and there Gregor's rotating movement. If only there hadn't been his father's unbearable hissing. Because of that, Gregor completely lost his composure. He was already almost entirely turned around, when, always with this hissing in his ear, he just made a mistake and turned himself back a little. But when he finally succeeded in getting his head in front of the door opening, it became clear that his body was too wide to pass through any further. Naturally, his father, in his present mental state, had no notion of opening the other wing of the door a bit to create a suitable passage for Gregor to get through. His single fixed idea was that Gregor must get into his room as swiftly as possible. He would never have countenanced the elaborate preparations which Gregor required to orient himself and thus perhaps pass through the door. On the contrary, as if there were no impediment, and with a peculiar noise, he now drove Gregor forwards. Behind Gregor, the sound was at this point no longer like the voice of only a single father. Now it was truly no longer a jest, and Gregor forced himself, come what might, into the doorway. One side of his body was lifted up. He lay at an angle in the door opening. His one flank was sore from the scraping. On the white door, ugly blotches were left. Soon he was stuck fast and would not have been able to move any further on his own. The tiny legs on one side hung twitching in the air above. Those on the other side were pressed painfully into the floor. Then his father gave him one truly strong, liberating push from behind, and he scurried, bleeding profusely, far into the interior of his room. The door was slammed shut with the cane, and finally it was quiet.